Hello, good people. This is Sister Julia Walsh, and you're listening to Messy Jesus Business. Welcome to the Mess. I'm here with Elizabeth Garlow, who is the co-founder of the Francesco Collaborative, which works with a community of investors to align their finances with the values and principles of Catholic social teaching. Elizabeth was influenced by her participation in the Focolare movement's Economy of Communion initiative. She previously co-led impact investing for the Lumina Foundation, served as a policy advisor with the Obama administration, and co-founded Michigan Core to invest in local Detroit area entrepreneurs. Elizabeth studied political economy at Kalamazoo College and completed her graduate work in public policy and economics at Princeton University. She lives in Michigan with her family. Elizabeth, welcome to Messy Jesus Business.
Thank you, Julia. It's so good to be with you.
So I like to start with folks' story. How did you become who you are? This leader of the Francesco Collaborative, a passionate advocate for social change, a woman who is concerned about justice. And as I know you've mentioned somewhere, this language of hospicing old paradigms and midwiving new ones. Wow. So how did this become your passion? And tell me your story.
Well, Julia, I had a lot of Franciscan influence early in my life. I grew up in and around the Midwest, and here in Detroit, there's a very active Capuchin community, and my family was in deep relationship with them. So growing up, we spent time with the Capuchin friars and working in the community. And I think just early on, I was sort of drawn to this Franciscan way of living an ethic of simplicity, of being in relationships of deep interconnectedness within our communities and with all of created reality, the created world. And I mention that because I think that sort of draw to a Franciscan spirit stayed with me my whole life. As a young girl, I got very involved in a lay Catholic movement called the Focolare movement.
Big fan of Focolare, by the way. I actually, Living City magazine, I'm a contributor to it.
So you have a good sense of the spirit of the community then. So I was really fortunate in that when I was younger and an athlete, actually, they organized a Sports for Peace event at my school. I was really drawn to the Focolare's invitation to show up as my full self, as someone who was interested as a young person in sports and also in interreligious dialogue. So after 9/11, I remember joining the Focolare movement in a global peace march that took place in Rome. And that had such a deep impact on me that by the time I became an undergraduate student of economics, I had already, between this kind of early Franciscan influence in my life and my time spent with Focolare movement, I had a sort of hunger to have a different kind of conversation about who we are as human beings, how we meet our needs, what kind of systems can we create. And here I was steeped in classical economic theory and wondering, like, there has to be a different set of conversations, right? And part of the kind of heterodox economics that one can be exposed to, whether through passionate professors or mentors or what have you, was a bit lacking for me. But then when I went to Latin America to study abroad, I was grateful in the opportunity to be more immersed in alternative schools of thought, different schools of thought around the economy and how we structure it. And a real important influence for me became the Focolare movement's Economy of Communion initiative. And so I ended up writing my thesis on this project. I spent time in Brazil and Argentina interviewing entrepreneurs who said, you know what, we actually want to live not so much into a transactional paradigm or way of thinking about our businesses, but into a relational paradigm. We want to put relationship at the center of how we structure and run these enterprises. And we want to live the gospel in very beautiful and radical ways. So it was really social gospel at work in this realm of business and economics that I was so passionate about. And so that was kind of how some of these interests began to hatch.
Wow. Yeah. And so now you're an economist and all these things have merged together. And it sounds like you're trying to find creative ways of integrating these spiritualities. And is it accurate for me to say that you're interested in like post-capitalism?
It's a great question. So I would say that I spent a about a decade working in the realm of finance, but finance leveraged for social impact oriented purposes. And as I was doing that kind of work, whether that was in the microfinance space, doing micro loans for small businesses, or working with social entrepreneurs, so entrepreneurs who had a kind of explicit social or environmental mission orientation in how they were building their businesses, I felt like I was trying to find tools of finance that could better serve them and their purposes, but I kept getting stuck actually. And at a certain point, I was longing for a different kind of conversation about how we don't just repeat some of the extractive forms of finance that are quite prevalent in our dominant capitalist culture and system, but how do we harness our interests in finance really being at the service of a different kind of economy rather than finance dictating the terms of the economy. The hunger for those kinds of questions and the desire to be in spaces to explore those is what really helped me recognize, oh, this is spiritual work. Like this work of unwinding a lot of inherited logic or dominant assumptions or training that I myself have or many of my peers have, that's hard work to do. I need a spiritual community to do that in. And so when Pope Francis launched the Economy of Francesco initiative in 2019, I heard in that an invitation and a call to really live into this intersection of spirit, economics, and finance differently. I saw a sort of readiness and a propensity to not just dream boldly about the future, but also a willingness to critique the structural problems of the economy as it exists today.
Let's define Economy of Francesco before we move into the weeds, because there's a lot of weeds we can go to. But for the listeners that don't know what it is, how do you quickly explain it for folks?
In 2019, Pope Francis wrote a letter inviting young people all around the world to imagine and build a moral economy. So he was very inspired by the role of young people in climate activism and said, how could we bring that same spirit to the realm of economics, given how much we're wrestling with global inequities, corporatized global indifference, a lot of the things that he raises in his letter Laudato Si and subsequently in Laudate Deum. So he wanted to bring that kind of conversation to the realm of economics, and it has since spurred a movement of people all over the world, including regional hubs in different parts of the world, where in particular young people, but young people in partnership with many others, are dreaming to imagine something different.
And as you say that, I'm aware that I am sitting here wearing my Global Mama's fair trade dress made by a women's cooperative in Ghana. Amazing. That I purchased a couple of weeks ago at the Minnesota State Fair, and they were trying to clear out their inventory so they could make room for new inventory at their warehouse in Minnesota. And I couldn't believe that this was a fair trade price because they were charging me $45 for it, right? Mm-hmm. And, I buy very few new clothing items, but if I do, I try to make sure that ethical practices have gone into the creation of the goods. Are those the sorts of things you're talking about as far as like the things that are happening globally in these little pockets of Economy of Francesco folks?
Yeah, so the Economy of Francesco hubs have taken on different expressions all over the world. And a lot of it is to your story about finding this dress. It opens us up to thinking about the ways that young people and others in different parts of the world are asking questions about how we really need to restructure business and get to the heart of questions around structures of power and ownership. And when we think about the role of social and solidarity economy influences, it really points to the various expressions of cooperative forms of ownership and stewardship of enterprises. And we see actually a number of those really beautiful initiatives in different parts of the world. Like I'm thinking of the Economy of Francesco hub in Mexico and in Mexico City. And there is a community of people connected to the Comparte network, which is an initiative run by the Jesuits where they are really trying to raise a solidarity economy fund to invest more in coffee cooperatives in Chiapas, Mexico. And all of this, Julia, really helps point to the need we have to really wrestle more with the ways that our status quo economy doesn't currently really price in a lot of these, what we would call negative externalities. So these negative impacts on our climate or on our communities, or the ways that we are failing to create good and dignified work for many people around the world. And this is so much of what Pope Francis reflects on too, is how the sort of global power imbalances that are perpetuated by our dominant economic system to continue to perpetuate practices of extraction, right? Where we are extracting from labor, in his words, to fuel the comfortable lifestyles of those in richer parts of the world. In this big, bold economy of Francesco invitation, how do we start to really reckon with what it means to acknowledge what the global economy is propping up in terms of those power imbalances?
It's super complex, but it's also completely relational, right? One of the things when I bought this dress at the fair was like, I got this little postcard that was like, do you want to go on a trip to Ghana and meet the dressmakers? Like,
Fascinating.
wow, I'd love to. I mean, not that I'm gonna, but like, how do we reimagine it in some ways like the old, right?
Yes.
Before the Industrial Revolution, when you would go down the streets and someone would make you your shoes and go to the next store and they'd make you your dress, and then so and so would be weaving the cloth, and all the people who are
Yes.
the goods that you're consuming, and you yourself are creating goods that you're selling for your own income to buy those goods. That's building up a community. What are the things that the regular consumer in the United States can be paying attention to and doing so that they're supporting these sorts of economy?
First, I think there's a lot we need to do just to reconceptualize of the economy and educate ourselves and talk about it differently. The economy is simply how we produce and provide for ourselves and one another. Like, it is not some amorphous, untouchable thing. we are constantly making the economy in ways small and large,
Yes.
in how we live our lives and how we show up. And the etymology of economy, oikonomia, is really care of the household. And so it begins in our own lives and in the people we are in relationship with, in our own homes, in our own neighborhoods, in our communities. And I think about in my community here in Southeast Michigan, we have started a neighborhood potluck where one of the intent purposes of this potluck was to practice a culture of reciprocity, noticing that, especially emerging from the pandemic, there was probably this like doubling down on self-reliance in ways that even if someone offered help, our tendency, especially in an individualistic culture, might be to say, I'm fine, I've got it, thank you, but I'm okay. Whereas what would it look like if we started to practice more of a logic of reciprocity and gift, where we received that help that was offered to us and we could in turn offer help to others? Yeah. And the primary point of that is to be in relationship, right? So to your point around more of a relational paradigm for our economy, I think it's so vital at a time in our lives and in our society where technological forces run the risk of creating even more rifts between us, such that a culture of encounter is something we have to be very intent on practicing. And so I'm excited about an economics that creates many of those opportunities for encounter. And I think about the work of Mia Birdsong in her book, How We Show Up, where she just reflects on what it means to be an expansive sense of family. And to me, I feel so blessed to be in relationship with communities of women religious in particular, like FSPA, where there is this legacy of practicing an expanded sense of family, of practicing asking for and receiving help and support, and finding more ways to put resources in common. So I would say that, yes, there are ways in which we can all be more conscientious in how and where we place our dollars in terms of the products we buy. So, for example, can we do less spending on Amazon and try to really localize more of our money? And also in our relationships with the people just around us and in our neighborhood communities, how do we start to think differently about the exchange of goods and services? Because again, that is economy. It's how we provide for ourselves and one another. So there are many creative ways to go about doing that.
Thank you for saying that so much. All of a sudden I'm thinking about, I need to get a new filter for the stove, and I better not buy that on Amazon. I should just take that filter to the hardware store and see if they have what I need. It's not that hard to do, right?
Well, and these things do take time. And,
Yeah.
the reality is many of us do feel pretty constrained on time. So I think there are choices, right? Often when I have conversations like this, it's just a reminder to me that this is so hard to do on your own.
Yes.
That like being in a community of people that you can discuss and discern these things with and who are practicing this way of life together is so fortifying, because it is very countercultural, right?
Yes.
Like we live in a culture of expediency and convenience,
Yes.
and that feeds into our own kind of consumeristic tendencies.
That's right, right. And we're swimming in materialism and trends, and we're making sure everything we have is like the hippest, coolest thing.
Like part of the throwaway culture.
Yeah, right?
Yes, that Frances has critiqued a lot.
Right. So I feel like my consciousness about these dynamics has been disturbed my entire adulthood. And there are still times that I get really overwhelmed, or I'm just lamenting, or I'm find myself being lazy and, getting what I need in the fastest way possible instead of the most relational and just way. What are you learning about how to keep the hope and the imagination alive as we're creating what is new and emerging and called for in this time?
I think what really keeps my hope alive is the sense of deepening connection and relationship that can come about from practicing a kind of relational economics in my own life, and also showing up to spaces and places where that is also the longing. So in our Francesco Collaborative community, we are more focused on really accompanying individuals and organizations and how they discern the use of their own finances and the practice of their investments. But it is so heartening as our community grows to see the ways people want to show up to be in a space of belonging together, right? If you think about trends of our time, like the US Surgeon General issued a warning last year on an epidemic of loneliness, right?
Yes, and serious stuff.
And I think this is important to acknowledge the ways that our status quo economy is intertwined. Like our economic structures are intertwined with problems of disconnection and loneliness. And so if we take that seriously and we ask, what is it that we're most deeply longing for? That kind of, quality relationship with each other, there are so many ways to strengthen and practice that in this space. And to me, money is an interesting place to start because like part of why I continue to work in this space of money is because I think it's an interesting leverage point or lead domino for getting to some of the deeper unlearning and relearning that we all have to do, because many of us have inherited trauma around money. And we live in a society here in the United States where there isn't really an adequate safety net. So there is this sense of hyper-individualism or self-sufficiency, and that myth of self-sufficiency perpetuates itself in ways that don't invite safety. And so how we talk about money and how we think about money actually points to something that has very little to do with money. It's actually these deeper questions around what it means to be safe, healthy, whole, and connected people. And I also think it's part of this kind of bringing people into a space where we can talk about spirituality, faith, and money together allows us to go to that deeper place rather than stay at this kind of what Pope Francis would call the technocratic paradigm, right? Just like moving the money around or finding the technocratic fixes for things. Like, no, there is something much deeper to engage here.
To clarify, are you interested in an economy where everyone has the same stuff and has the same income?
Fascinating question.
Or another way, I could ask it more formally, is, my style's so casual, sorry.
No, it's great.
It's like, is part of the motive here combating income inequality, increasing equity, because that increases justice, right?
Right.
Is that part of the goal? And when you imagine how that manifests,
right,
does that mean that there's no more difference?
So I think I'm going to reflect on our context here in the US because it's quite particular. My personal view is that we need some kind of threshold for quality of life that ensures that we are helping to meet the basic needs of our brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
There are many terms for that. You could call that the human rights economy. You could call that a basic safety net. You could call that what Natalie Foster has written. She's written about the guarantee economy. So we want to ensure that there is enough to live and lead a dignified life.
Yes.
And I think beyond that, there is a lot of room for groups and individuals to discern what is enough. Because everybody's context is unique in particular. What people carry in their bodies and in their souls is unique in particular. Their needs are going to be different. Their gifts are going to be different. So I do believe in a world in which we are showing up to grow into the fullness of our potential and our giftings and our offerings. And I think that's going to look different. And if we want to use the analogy of the body of Christ, we are all part of the body of Christ, and we are all called in our own unique ways and vocations, right? So I hope this gets to some of what your question was interested in, but I do think we need to do more to ensure that people can have a good and dignified life. And I think there are so many people, because of lack of access to power or privilege, who do not have inherited wealth or do not have access to ownership or wealth creation. And part of what I'm interested in is how do we flow capital in ways that might open up those doors and invite more people into experiences of agency and self-determination and access and ownership. And then taking it a step beyond that, how do we rethink ownership itself to kind of get us out of just a very narrow individual private lens on that to something that's maybe more collective, right? And there are kind of a growing number of legal structures that might be able to hold ownership differently. And again, communities of religious have been doing this and practicing this for centuries.
Yes,
so I think there's so much wisdom to offer our world today about what it looks like to think about ownership more collectively and more broadly.
I do too. I'm a fan of this model that I'm living. Yes.
Beautiful.
You mentioned investing, and I know there's the phrase that we use in religious life circles is impact investing. And there's certain principles that the economy of Francesco and the Francesco Collaborative is interested in when they're making choices about where to move the capital. What are your tips for someone who maybe has been, doing what's customary and just investing in stock at the stock market level? And, I don't know enough about how to talk about even ask this question, but
very few of us do. It's not a part of our education, right?
Yeah,
This is part of the problem. So I think your question is spot on because, so for example, I know a number of people who maybe are interested in the Laudato Si Action platform, and they read this goal of ecological economics, and then they're like, Elizabeth, I have no idea what this means. How do I actually live this? So in Francesco Collaborative, we've done a lot with organizations, with institutions, with communities of women religious and others around their corpus of investments, right? And how do they take an endowment or savings or set of investment holdings and move that in ways that align deeply with values and charism and mission. And that is a whole conversation. I'm glad to go there. We could talk about the institutional side. What I'm hearing you ask about is also just the personal side. Like many of us who maybe have used retirement savings or saved in ways we just default into a pretty conventional portfolio in the public markets, right? And we have very little control over it and we don't really touch it that much. So there are a couple of ways I would answer this. One is there are people who have really been wrestling with how do you do ethical investing in the public markets? Things are so bundled and combined now that it's really hard to do super high integrity investing and be very selective. There are some resources, there's one group called Odyssey and Social Capital, and there are others who do direct indexing of public market funds. So you can really think about how might I align my resources with exchange traded funds or mutual funds or things that are more aligned to the demands of social movements or social justice advocates or different groups. That's part of what Odyssena does. And we engaged with them because they were willing to create a separately managed account that also layered Catholic screening criteria on top of that. So, how do we show up to shape the marketplace in ways that really meet the needs of individuals and organizations that want to do Catholic investing work? And then there's a project called The Next Egg, which was started by the Sustainable Economies Law Center, which has provided all sorts of really useful educational resourcing for people who might be self-employed or have self-employment income who want to invest in the public markets in ways that are really aligned with ethical criteria. For me and for my family and our journey, we've really had to take a step back and say, okay, the bigger question here is, what is enough for us, and what savings do we really need, like in our own family unit, right? The dominant cultural practice is to say, accumulate and hoard as much as possible, right?
Yeah. More.
Yeah, more is better. And it's in our Francesco Collaborative community, we talk about this as the ethic of maximization that permeates in explicit and implicit ways across our culture and in our lives. Again, going back to that Franciscan spirituality and ethic of enoughness, feels like a really important starting point. And again, this is hard to do on your own. We need communities of support and communities of practice to do that. But upon that, we can then say, okay, do we have resources in excess that we might gift? Do we have resources that we need to save, but how do we save those by circulating them in local economies? So we've moved some of those resources into credit unions. There are all sorts of things like impact deposits within local credit unions where you can hold those resources at a very modest return, but in a very safe and stable way. And then there are more financial advisors, thank goodness, who are really trying to specialize in this work to say, we want to offer an alternative to just going into this very conventional Vanguard ETF or something and say, we actually want to create opportunities for you to invest in Main Street or in your local community. And I'll give an example of an investment cooperative that I invested in, which is the Quechua Cooperative. And this is an investment cooperative that is funding cooperative housing and enterprise projects and has a strong climate lens on it. So that is accessible to individuals as well as to organizations. So this is part of the challenge, Julia, is that if you're not an organization or a really wealthy individual, sometimes there aren't as many options available to you. So there are groups that I think are really trying to change that.
Curious, you mentioned the Catholic screening principles? Can you just name what those are?
So I can't rattle them off the top of my head right now, but it is very common for Catholic conferences of bishops to offer guidance on investment practices. So like the USCCB has investment guidance that names recommended criteria for screening your investments. What that typically does is it screens things out. So it says, we're not going to be invested in tobacco, in firearms, in abortifacient, et cetera. So there's a list of criteria that's commonly circulated. And a lot of what our community focuses on is, what do you want to screen in? So like, you know what you're against, what are we for? What are the positive investments that we want to select and make?
I mean, I come from a farming community in Iowa, and I was pretty concerned when I learned that a religious community that I was part of was investing in Monsanto, who I think has been rebranded since then. And they were doing it in a way to justify that, we're doing this so that we have enough proxy votes to change something. And for myself, I think there's a lot of ethical questions about, like, when someone's whole business is based on a whole philosophy that I disagree with, do I even want to be in relationship or in conversation? Or do I try to go change this whole monster? And I think people get to make different choices about how they engage in those things, don't they?
Oh, it's such a good example, because there's a long tradition in our Catholic communities of what we would call shareholder advocacy. So it's this idea that you invest in something to hold shares to then vote your proxy and try to shift corporate behavior. And it's beautiful and noble work. I think it's also getting even more complicated to do that work well because of the consolidation in the asset management space and also changing regulations, right? So I know many coalitions of responsible investing that Women Religious and others are a part of who are trying to navigate these changing thresholds on ownership to be able to even vote a proxy anymore. The trends are moving in the direction of having less influence than they used to have. And so it's a healthy conversation. In part, the way I think about it is it's a little bit of how do we think we want to be engaged in trying to change the world and living our values. And there's a really helpful movement ecology framework from the INE Institute that includes a few archetypes of change that I often use with our community. So one is personal transformation. Each of us is always engaged in this unfolding work of personal transformation, of ecological conversion, and we often do that through encounter and through the relationships that are in our lives, like you mentioned before. Another is changing dominant institutions. So it's looking at the power structures that be, recognizing that corporate structures we have today are not fit for purpose. They do not meet the needs of our times. And Pope Francis repeatedly calls us to see that. And there are things like shareholder advocacy where you can be trying to transform those institutions, those dominant institutions. The third is creating new alternatives. So when are we being called to point to a different kind of future economy? When are we being called to seed a different set of alternatives to the status quo or to the dominant? And I think those all have to interplay, because we're not going to transform institutions without transforming ourselves. We're not going to necessarily be able to build the healthy new alternatives without a healthy critique of the dominant system. So they all play together.
It sounds like a well-balanced three-legged stool.
Ooh, it's a good three-legged stool.
So we've explored a lot of things here, and I feel like we could keep talking for a long time. So I'm wondering if there's more you'd like to describe, especially when it comes to the practicalities of creating the alternative realities and like building up the community and the solidarity economy, and best tips so that our listeners can get out there and start trying some things out.
Yeah. I think to go on this journey, we've often used this quote, which I believe is from Father Richard Rohr, that we don't think our way into a new way of acting, we live our way into a new way of thinking. And so in our community, we've often invited people to go on transformative learning journeys together. So we have what we call our Livable Future Investing workshop. It's like a 1-month online intensive. We've organized some solidarity economy immersion trips. Like you mentioned, going to visit the cooperative in Ghana where your dress was made. We took a group of people to visit the Industrial Commons Cooperative in North Carolina, which is in the textile manufacturing district. And it's in meeting people face to face and in encountering their stories that we are truly moved, right? To see.
Encuentro, like Pope Francis.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think part of what I really hope our community can offer is a place for people to take bold risks together. I am so formed by and moved by religious communities, in particular women religious, who in the 1970s took big risks with their retirement savings and said, we're going to make an investment in Shore Bank. We want our resources to circulate in the community. And it pioneered and helped birth the community development finance movement. Now, my first job was in one of those CDFIs. It was in a community development finance institution. And I think about that a lot, that my life has been shaped and formed by the risks that those sisters took 50 years ago. And I really want to ask, what are the risks we can take together today? What are the new kind of prophetic horizons? How is that charism evolving and finding new expressions across religious communities and lay Catholics and many other friends on the journey? So I want to create spaces where we can build community loan funds together, where we can be in discernment together about good financial discipleship and ask, what does it mean beginning in our own lives to practice this a little bit differently? And then hopefully that will fractal up, that will layer into institutional transformations. Now, this is complex and nuanced work, and I often feel overwhelmed by just how big some of the problems are. Like, there's a book that I would commend to your readers called Wealth Supremacy by Marjorie Kelly, where she really talks about how our culture today is steeped in this paradigm of capital supremacy, where all interests are subordinate to the interests of capital. You could say the same thing about the economy. We've talked about the economy as something that we are serving rather than the economy here to serve our flourishing, our collective and shared flourishing. So we need to flip these things on their head.
Which is church teaching, by the way, if anyone's like, that's
Say more.
Read the church documents. That is the root of Catholic social teaching. The economy is meant to be serving the people and honoring our dignity. We are not here to be slaves to the economy.
Exactly, Julia.
I just want to preach it.
Please do. And this is why I think we use Catholic social teaching as a framework for these learning journeys, for the Livable Future Investing workshops. Because when you look at those principles of Catholic social thought and you look at that history, there is so much amazing content in there. Like, I think about in the 1930s, this Dominican priest, Father Lebray, who was observing the abuses of workers in the fisheries of southern France, kind of hatched this way of living into a culture of mutualism, an economy of mutualism, and understanding our needs much more holistically. Our needs are not just material, they are also spiritual, right? They're educational, psychological, communal, etc. And so he laid the groundwork for a lot of the theory of integral development and things that were eventually codified in future church documents and today form a basis for a renewed vision of global development. So there's so much richness in our heritage, in our spiritual and religious heritage. And I think we need to call it back up and call it back forth for inspiration as we think about remaking the economy for the future.
You know, in Shelby County, Iowa, the Shelby County Catholics, I couldn't tell you all the details of the history, but I understand about 100 years ago, the priest there in one of these little towns was especially informed in these principles. And instead of asking the farmers to tithe 10% of their income, simply put up a silo at, this is probably inaccurate, but this is my understanding. Imagine with me, put up a silo at the church and said, we're all tithing 10% of our crops. And so built up a Catholic farmers cooperative that then funded the church and all of its ministries for a year. Ultimately, they ended up building a ball diamond and a bar because these things build community in a small Catholic town, right?
Awesome.
With their funds. This is the way that when the church is recognizing how it can use its power, and all of us can use our power to affect the change that we believe in because we love and believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ, it ultimately can lead to transformations locally and globally. I mean, that's where my sister got married.
What a beautiful story.
I love that I went from the church to the church hall to the bar and learned that the bar was owned by the church.
So great.
Yeah. Our time's winding down. Well, I'd love to close our conversation by offering you a chance to comment on the messiness of gospel living and discipleship in general, and what that means for you and what you're thinking about nowadays as you continue to stay devoted to this pursuit for justice through the lens of your faith.
I feel like in our conversation, which has been so beautiful, we've reflected on bits and pieces of discipleship, but my lens on this in many ways is about financial discipleship. It's like, how do we acknowledge that so often money has been left to be this private affair and how we manage our money. But what if we were journeying together as disciples of our faith in how we think about and invest and save and move our money in the world? Because money in many ways is energy, it is flow, it is not something that we are slaves to, as the gospel, teaches us. And it can be a linchpin to do the personal transformation work around our own fears of scarcity or the journey to really trust and surrender that we are co-creating so much with God in this world, that it is not all on our shoulders. And so I find that whether it's really rethinking economics or rethinking money, that there is a really ripe invitation today to be disciples together on that journey and to practice some of these countercultural ways of thinking and living and working that we've been talking about. I think about the practice of Sabbath and how much in our current economy, in our current culture, we have to really fight to have moments of Sabbath in our lives and rest, because we have so much internalized culture around productivity and that our worth is so deeply connected to that productivity. But rest is sacred. And to be in those kinds of countercultural practices together, I think we need to be in circles of discipleship. So that's what I'd say about discipleship. I think on the gospel living piece, I mean, goodness, as someone who has journeyed in and out of different circles of public policy and finance, it's so easy to get caught up in this narrative of what we would call upward mobility, like always up, always better, always more, like perpetual growth mindsets. And I think in many ways, the gospel calls us into downward mobility. It calls us to sit with the outcast. It calls us to humble ourselves in ways that are not at all what our dominant stories of the economy call us into. And so it's culture work in many ways. Living the gospel in this realm feels to me like cultural transformation. I think it requires a lot of courage.
Yeah.
It requires a lot of courage. And so I draw so much inspiration and fortification from listening to and reflecting on scripture together in our community. I think about the story of Zacchaeus and being called down from the tree and asking ourselves, like, who's standing at the foot of our trees? Like, who do we need to be in relationship with? Who should we be encountering, but that we're missing because we're up here, right? So I think there's so much richness in the wisdom of the scriptures that we can be drawing in to really to do that work of cultural transformation.
Amen. Well, I'm so glad we're in it together.
Me too, Julia. Thank you. Thank you for who you are and for your inspiration as well in all of this.
I mean, we need each other, so thank you.
We do.
Yeah, we really do. Elizabeth, as we sign out, what would you like our listeners to know about how they can learn more if they were fascinated by these topics, and how they can support you in your ministries?
Oh, thank you. We have a website at the Francesco Collaborative, so it's just francescocollaborative.org. If you find yourself interested in going deeper on this topic, we have online workshops and events. We're doing more events in person in different communities, starting in the US and Canada. So we would totally welcome you there. I would say also, as part of this journey around learning, there's a lot of reading that I could recommend. There's a book that our community uses called Real Impact by Morgan Simon, which is full of just a lot of beautiful stories and concrete examples of how we need to shift our practices of finance and investment. And then there's a book called The Alternative by Nick Romeo, which I find really helpful in terms of situating ourselves inside the broader economic paradigm that we're swimming in and seeing it for what it is, seeing it a little bit more clearly. Yeah. The Economy of Francesco, also as a global movement, is looking for supporters, people who can really come behind youth organizers in different parts of the world. There's a beautiful project called the Farms of Francesco, which is promoting regenerative agricultural practices in exchange between parts of Latin America and Africa. There's a group in Colombia that's rethinking economics education. So there are ways in which, if you just search the Economy of Francesco, you will also find ways to show up in support of that work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thanks for coming on Messy Jesus Business.
My pleasure. It was wonderful to be with you. Thank you.
Messy Jesus Business is produced and edited by Colin Wamskans. You can find us online at messyjesusbusiness.com and on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Patreon. If you like what you heard, please be sure to mention our podcast to your friends and followers. And we'd love to have your support via Patreon. From the bottom of our hearts and the middle of the mess, thank you. Messy Jesus Business is produced in partnership with the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration. You can learn more about our religious community and donate to our mission at www.fspa.org. I'm Sister Julia Walsh, and I'll catch up with you next time. Until then, peace and all good.